Welcome to the Nurburgring for round 12, where Jones started on pole alongside Hutchings in his first race. There was some trouble at the back heading into turn 1, with the red Canada Speedworks cars being sent spinning. The front of the pack got through the opening corners safely, with Jones and Hutchings remaining in first and second, followed by Walker and Portis. Our championship leader Whitlock was running in 7th, but he was actually ahead of championship rivals Tim Shade and Friesen further back. With some new drivers joining the league, there were 28 cars in this grid, and there was some more drama as the pack reached the hairpin. It was Fukara ending up sideways after contact with Polo, and while De Groot in his first race was trying to catch back up to the pack after some trouble at the start, he collided with Fukara, but fortunately his car still looked drivable after the collision. Hutchings was having a better first race in second, but as the rain started falling he spun on a curb on lap 3, painfully dropping to 9th. On lap 4 Wheaton had bumped into De Roche, and his car was absolutely ruined after it had bounced into the air, losing a lot of time fixing the damage, and would emerge from the pits with a repaired car a couple of laps later. The rain was gradually falling harder, and on lap 5 Pitch had a spin from the curb at the Schumacher S, drifting off track to the right before his car dangerously crossed over and struck the wall on the left. His car was still drivable, but he dropped from 13th all the way to 26th. Fukara had pitted after this accident and would have a troubled race in his rear-engined car, while their front-engined cars were handling better in this particular race, with all of the Porsche cars dropping back. And in particular, Fukara had some bad luck after pitting from that accident and spun at the end of the outlap, despite changing to wet tyres. Then rather than cut across the pit entrance to rejoin the track, had taken the safe option of driving into the pits again. Fukara, like many of the drivers, would have some more spins as the conditions got worse. A few drivers also committed to wet tyres for their mandatory pit stop around that time, with Collis slowing down in the pit lane, bringing his average speed down, likely to avoid an automatic penalty, but frustratingly he still got an automatic stop and go penalty as he left the pits, I assume for crossing the white line, and later McAdams also got a stop and go while exiting the pits. Sean Bowers had picked up some suspension damage after smacking the side of his Honda into the wall, and spent some time with an early pit stop to repair the damage. Then at the end of his outlap, he was being overlapped by the cars he had been racing against for track position only a few minutes ago, but slight contact with Rees sent him sideways, so unfortunately he was now more than a lap down. Patterson had been keeping pressure on Rees, until Rees lost grip and ran over the pit entrance, allowing Patterson to move through to 8th. As the sun set, our championship leader Whitlock was running in 4th, and with a points lead heading into the last few races, he still had a chance of winning the championship even if he kept finishing off the podium. Conditions were still getting worse, and De Roche on dry tyres had spun, losing a few seconds, so he took his mandatory pit stop and switched over to wet tyres. At the start of lap 13 Jones lost the lead, spinning on the curb and nudging the tyre barrier. He lost 2 positions and took his pit stop at the end of that lap, with Blair now in first and Walker in second. But Blair's lead of the race was short-lived, as he pitted at the end of that lap and would spin twice shortly afterwards, retiring on lap 17 after a third spin. Gould was occasionally running off track, with his worst moment being at the start of lap 13, but he managed to keep his car out of the wall and avoid spinning, likely drawing on his race experience to avoid overcorrecting when he could just let the car roll and patiently rejoin the track when the grip returned. Wolf also spun on the start of lap 13 and would pit that lap, but later had another spin. Leroy Bowers had exited the pits on that lap, but drove back into the pits at the end of the outlap, I assume because he mistakenly ended up on dry tyres again, and did get onto the wet tyres on his second pit stop. There was more bad luck for Fukara in this race, as on lap 15, Rees, while overlapping Fukara's Porsche, had accidentally run deep and clouted the side of it, and potentially that had damaged the Porsche, because Fukara kept losing control of it for the next few corners, and soon took a long pit stop, no doubt repairing the car, and emerged from the pits in last position, but stayed in the race despite everything that had gone wrong, including a couple more spins towards the end. Jones initially had good pace when the track was dry, but as the conditions got worse his setup proved to be unstable. Many of the drivers lost time here and there from similar spins. On lap 18 De Groot crashed just before the pit entry, and having already done his mandatory pit stop, had decided to cross over to the racing line, waiting for a safe moment to get underway again, but ended up having to wait so long that he almost would have been better off just driving through the pits. He'd do exactly the same thing 10 laps later, but that time fortunately he didn't have to wait long for a gap in traffic. On lap 19 Sean Bowers was only a couple of seconds ahead of Shaw, and was probably trying to avoid losing time while being overlapped, wanting to stay ahead of Shaw in their battle for 21st, and there's a points difference between 22nd and 21st, but Bowers ran a bit deep as Rees was overlapping him, similarly to Rees having run deep colliding with Fucara 4 laps earlier. Bowers pitted at the end of the lap, which was his second pit stop. The front of the pack had each done their pit stops, so a leader emerged, which was Walker for a short time, until Hutchings impressively got into the lead, despite having spun, losing several seconds earlier in the race. Pitch had crashed a few laps earlier, and had this unfortunate little crash from the curb wall making room for the overtaking car of Whitlock. Pitch took a second pit stop at the end of that lap, repairing his damaged Mercedes, but dropped from 17th to 24th. On lap 21, Shaw had already done 2 pit stops, and spun on that lap before crashing, likely picking up suspension damage, and retired from the race. Patterson had caught up to Walker in the battle for second, and kept Walker under pressure, and there was almost a collision on lap 24, leading to Patterson losing some time. By lap 26 he was finally getting through, and Whitlock had caught up, also getting through a lap later. And unfortunately for Walker, after having lost those 2 positions, his car spun into the barrier, but seemed to get away without damage, and had enough of a gap behind not to lose any further positions. Panda was not having a good race, having done a few pit stops, and then there was more pit entry drama, as Panda's car on the dry tyres struck the entrance, before Panda put it in reverse, and drove into the pits to get onto wet tyres. On lap 25 Sean Bowers had crashed, and then spun shortly afterwards, losing a position, but he soon caught back up to retake the position, and it turned out to be his brother Leroy Bowers. So the two were side by side changing track position, much like the Shade brothers had been doing further ahead. That is until Friesen ended up in the Shade sandwich, splitting them up, and in that moment Tim had spun, losing several seconds before getting back up to speed. File in his first race had a couple of spins towards the end. Hosick had spun a few times, and had this little accident just before the end. Whitlock and Patterson were battling over second, and no doubt Whitlock wanted those 5 extra points to help hold on to the lead of the championship. The position was decided by contact at the chicane, with Patterson going through, and there not being enough race distance left for Whitlock to catch up and challenge him again. Just before the race leader arrived at the end, there was an accident, so there was drama from start to finish, largely I think due to much of this 37 lap race involving rain and poor visibility. Like Patterson had done a couple of races ago, a new driver had shown a mixture of confidence and speed, winning on their first entry of the season. It was Hutchings in the only BMW on the grid, having stayed consistent in those difficult conditions. Patterson did finish ahead of Whitlock, and the drama still wasn't over. Jones and Rees were battling over 5th, when contact led to Jones spinning off track, and he was stuck in the gravel, desperately trying to get out, cycling through the gears, eventually getting the car moved in reverse. Rees had slowed down after the incident, but when Jones didn't appear, he had continued with his race, presuming that Jones had retired. Jones did manage to get out of the gravel after what must have felt like a long time, but Rees was already at the checkered flag. However, he slowed down right at the line, losing a position to Dan Shade, but was a gentleman, making sure that Jones got back ahead of him. Jones had taken the fastest lap, and must have felt relieved getting out of the gravel at the end. Whitlock with an 85-point lead was close to winning the championship. The team standings are still open, with the Shade Bros in second very capable of winning the team championship. So that was our very dramatic round 12, and we have 3 rounds left in the championship. Our next stop is the ever popular Suzuka circuit, so do join us again for our highlights next week.